The year is 1920. A damp, dimly lit office in Canton, Ohio holds the weight of a dying dream. Rain streaks against the single grime-covered window, and the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco hangs heavy in the air. A group of men hunker down around a scarred, uneven wooden table. Their knuckles are white as they grip the edges, leaning into the flickering light. The floorboards groan under their weight. Every shadow in the room seems to press inward, mirroring the isolation of their cause. They are not titans of industry yet. They are scavengers, huddled in the dark, trying to piece together a future from nothing. The table is covered in ink-stained ledgers and crumpled maps, yet no one speaks. The silence is thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of a pen. They are staring at the blueprints of an idea that the rest of the country has already dismissed. Outside, the world is moving on. But in this cramped, cold space, these men are fighting to keep a flickering spark alive. The foundation of a future empire is being laid. Beyond the office walls, the reality of the game was far from glamorous. These teams were born in the shadow of smokestacks, playing on fields that were little more than patches of churned mud and frozen dirt. When the rain fell, the gridiron turned into a swamp. Players dragged themselves through the muck for pay that barely covered a week of meals. There was no glory here, only the dull ache of bruised ribs and the cold bite of autumn wind. They were local curiosities, ignored by the press and overshadowed by the rising popularity of baseball. Respect was a currency they could not afford. A player might start the season in one town, only to vanish by midweek, jumping to a rival squad for an extra $5. Loyalty was a luxury, and stability was non-existent. Fans wandered in and out of the stands, confused by the shifting rosters and the lack of a clear schedule. The owners watched their pockets empty as they scrambled to keep the teams afloat. Every game was a desperate attempt to prove they existed, yet the world outside remained indifferent to their struggle. They were chasing a dream that had no name, no authority, and no future, fighting for scraps of attention. To bridge the gap between their disparate teams, the men reached for legitimacy. They drafted a charter, seeking to bind their scattered interests into a single, cohesive entity. They chose a name that sounded official, heavy, and undeniably permanent: the American Professional Football Association. The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. It was a title born from a lawyer's desk, not a stadium. When spoken aloud, the name felt like a bureaucratic tangle, a sequence of syllables that rolled off the tongue like a dry legal document. It lacked the fire of competition or the rhythm of a game. It was a mouthful of syllables that meant nothing to the average fan. The owner stared at the ink on the page, the weight of the title pressing down on the scarred table. It was designed to command respect, yet it possessed the personality of a ledger entry. They had traded their anonymity for a label that sounded like a tax filing. The name did not inspire, it merely categorized. In that dim office, they had created a structure that was technically sound, yet entirely hollow. It was a name that promised order but delivered only confusion. While these men huddled over their legal papers, the rest of the nation was looking elsewhere. Baseball was the undisputed king of American sports. It owned the summer, the headlines, and the hearts of the public. From the bustling streets of New York to the quiet corners of the Midwest, the crack of a bat was the sound of the era. The owners of these fledgling football teams were not pioneers in the eyes of the public. They were scavengers. They stood on the periphery of the sporting world, fighting for the scraps of attention that baseball left behind. Every time they tried to promote a game, they were met with a wall of apathy. Newspapers ignored their scores. The owners watched as the crowds flocked to the diamond, leaving the gridiron empty and silent. They were invisible, and in the brutal economy of 1920s entertainment, being invisible was the same as being dead. The organization existed only on paper. There was no central office, no headquarters, and no administrative hub to anchor their ambitions. When an owner in one town wanted to challenge a rival, he had to send a telegram and hope for a reply. There was no fixed schedule to guide the season, no master calendar to coordinate the chaos. Every weekend was a gamble, a frantic scramble to find an opponent, a field, and a referee. The owners sat in their respective towns, isolated by distance and the lack of a governing body. They tried to set dates, but the plans dissolved as quickly as they were made. One team might play 4 games in a month, while another sat idle. There was no authority to enforce a standard, no league office to mediate disputes, and no structure to hold the disparate teams together. They were architects without a blueprint, building a house on shifting sand, waiting for the first gust of wind to tear it all down. The instability was not just in the offices. It bled onto the field. Loyalty was a luxury no team could afford. A player might suit up for a squad in Canton on Sunday, only to appear in the colors of a rival town by the following weekend. The incentive was simple: $5. For a handful of bills, a man would pack his bag and walk away from his teammates. There were no binding contracts to hold them, no legal barriers to stop the exodus. Owners watched in silence as their best talent vanished. Fans were left bewildered. They would show up to the field expecting to see their local heroes, only to find strangers filling the positions. The names on the jerseys meant nothing because the faces behind them changed every week. This constant churn turned the sport into a revolving door. It destroyed any chance of building a connection with the community. A team could not be a source of pride when it was a collection of transient workers. The game became a farce, a chaotic shuffle of bodies that left the spectators disconnected and the owners powerless. The foundation was dissolving. By the dawn of 1921, the illusion of progress evaporated. The calendar turned, but the fortunes of the league plummeted. Attendance figures, once modest, now plummeted to abysmal lows. On game days, the silence in the stands was louder than the cheers. Owners arrived at their meetings with hollow eyes, carrying ledgers stained with red ink. They looked at the rows of empty wooden benches and realized the truth. Nobody was watching. The house of cards they had built was not just leaning, it was buckling under the weight of its own irrelevance. Every attempt to generate interest had failed. They had tried to sell a product that lacked a pulse, a game that felt like a local curiosity. The financial pressure mounted as the reality of bankruptcy loomed over every town. They sat in that dim, smoke-filled office staring at the maps. The desperation in the room was palpable. The league was failing, and without a radical shift, the entire experiment would be erased. The final blow to their relevance came from the morning papers. The owners sent out their weekly summaries, hoping for a few lines of print to stir public interest. They waited by the telegraph offices, checking the early editions, but found nothing. Not a score, not a mention. When they finally confronted the editors, the answer was brutal in its simplicity. The name, American Professional Football Association, was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was too long, too clunky, and took up too much space. One editor held up a proof, his pencil hovering over the page. He pointed to the sprawling, multi-word title and shook his head. There was no room for such a mouthful. It did not fit the rhythm of the headlines, and it certainly did not capture the attention of a reader. The league was being edited out of existence, one character at a time. It was a silent, systematic erasure. Because they could not be named, they could not be seen. The league existed in a vacuum, a ghost organization that left no footprint. They were fighting for scraps, but they were not even invited to the table. The meeting room in Canton felt smaller than it had months ago. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. The owners sat around the scarred table, their faces etched with the deep, jagged lines of exhaustion. They were men who had bet everything on a gamble that was now hemorrhaging cash. One by one, they laid their ledgers out. The numbers were not just poor, they were catastrophic. Debts had piled up like cordwood. Stadium rentals were overdue, and players' salaries had become a distant, unreachable promise. A heavy silence hung over the table as they stared at the final tallies. No one spoke. The reality of bankruptcy was no longer a distant threat looming on the horizon. It was sitting in the room with them, pulling at their sleeves. One man pushed a stack of unpaid invoices toward the center of the table, his hand trembling slightly. The paper scraped against the wood, a harsh sound in the quiet space. They were at the absolute bottom of their collective journey. Every resource was exhausted, every connection had been tapped. The league was a hollow shell, and the men responsible for it were staring into the void of total financial ruin, waiting for the final collapse to claim what little remained of their ambition. The silence in the room finally broke, not with a solution, but with a cold, hard truth. One owner leaned forward, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the table. He looked at the ledgers, then at the men around him, and spoke the words that shifted the entire trajectory of the room. They were not a league. They were just a collection of strangers chasing a ball across a field. Without a brand, without a cohesive identity, they were invisible. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The weight of their failure suddenly had a name: anonymity. They were building on sand. The desperation in the room began to harden into something else. A singular, sharp focus. They had to tear down the old, ineffective structure and replace it with something that could command the attention of a nation. The search for a symbol began with the dismantling of their old perspective. They looked at the maps pinned to the walls, tracing the lines between small industrial towns, and realized these boundaries were their cage. One owner stood up and crossed to the window, watching the street below. He turned back and pointed to the table. They needed to stop thinking like local shopkeepers and start thinking like architects of a national movement. The conversation shifted from gate receipts to the concept of scale. They debated what a name should carry. It needed to be more than a descriptor. It needed to be a promise. They analyzed the way baseball held the public imagination, noting how every team felt like a piece of a larger, unified whole. They began to strip away the regional baggage that had anchored them to the mud. No more town-centric pride. No more fragmented schedules. They wanted a name that sounded like a standard. The atmosphere in the room thickened, turning heavy with the weight of the final decision. They had spent hours dissecting the failures of the past, but now they faced the most difficult task of all: total erasure. To move forward, they had to strike the old name from the records, effectively killing the identity they had spent years trying to build. One by one, the owners stopped speaking. The air felt thin. They looked at the documents spread across the table, the ink still fresh on the pages that defined their current, struggling existence. This was the final gamble. If they removed the APFA, they would have no safety net, no history to fall back on, and no guarantee that the new name would hold any weight. They were essentially betting their entire future on a single, percussive shift in branding. The tension was palpable. Every second of silence in that office was a testament to the risk. The pen hovered over the paper, ready to strike. The pen moved. It did not hesitate. The nib cut through the ink of the old name, dragging a jagged line across the paper that rendered the past obsolete. The sound of the scratch was deafening in the stillness. Then, the pen stopped. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise. It was a vacuum. Every man in the room held his breath, watching the ink bleed into the fibers of the page. The APFA was gone. The bureaucratic tangle, the confusion, the local obscurity, it had all been erased in one deliberate stroke. The table, once the center of their arguments, now felt like a raft in the middle of a dark, uncharted sea. They stared at the void they had created. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the decision settled into the room, pressing against their chests. They had stripped away their foundation, leaving themselves exposed and nameless. For these few seconds, they were nothing. They waited, listening to the rhythm of their own hearts. The silence shattered. One man leaned forward, his hands flat against the scarred wood, and spoke the proposal into the center of the room. He did not offer a sentence. He offered 3 letters: N-F-L. The sounds hung in the air, sharp and percussive, cutting through the lingering dread of the void. They were not just initials. They were a strike of lightning in a stagnant sky. The room seemed to contract around the syllables. Each man tested the weight of the letters on his tongue, feeling the sudden, cold clarity they provided. These were not the soft, bureaucratic syllables of the past. They were hard. They were aggressive. They were a declaration of intent. The owners exchanged glances, searching for doubt, but found only a sudden, desperate alignment. If these 3 letters failed to capture the public, there would be no second chance. It was a final epitaph or a new beginning, and the choice rested entirely on the rhythm of those 3 sounds. They repeated them again, louder this time, letting the syllables fill the corners of the office. The air shifted. They were no longer just scavengers. They were architects of a new order. The vote was unanimous. The name was officially struck into the record, the National Football League. The words carried a weight that the old title never possessed. As the ink dried, the room felt different. The cramped office in Canton suddenly seemed too small for the ambition they had just unleashed. The word national did more than fix a bureaucratic error. It projected a map across the continent. It promised a scale that reached beyond the muddy fields of Ohio. Each man looked at the others, seeing the shift in their posture. They were the architects of a countrywide pursuit. The name acted as a lens, focusing their scattered efforts. They saw the potential for stadiums, for travel, for a league that moved across state lines with authority. They stood up, the chairs scraping against the floor, and for the first time, the future looked like a straight, paved road. The ink on the charter was barely dry when the real test began. The owners scattered, carrying the new name into the streets. They needed the morning papers to bite. For years, the press had ignored them, burying their results in the back pages. Now they waited. The city woke to the rhythmic clatter of printing presses. In the early light, the newsboys fanned out. One owner stood on a corner watching a passerby unfold a paper. His heart hammered against his ribs. The man scanned the sports section, his eyes darting across the columns. There it was. Not buried, not hidden. The letters NFL stood bold and black at the top of the page. The punchy, percussive name fit perfectly within the margins. It was a visual victory. The press had finally taken the bait. Reporters who had once turned their backs were now writing the name with ease. The sport had a face, a shape, and a space in the public consciousness. The game was no longer a ghost, it was news. Visibility was only the first step. The owners knew that a name meant nothing if the players remained ghosts. The era of the mercenary was a rot that had to be cut out. Before the ink on the new charter had settled, the league office issued a mandate. Every player was now bound by a formal, written contract. No more jumping teams on a Sunday morning for an extra $5. The change hit the locker rooms like a cold front. One veteran, a man who had played for 3 different towns in a single month, walked into the office with a smirk, ready to negotiate his next move. He found the door locked. The owner sat behind a desk piled high with legal filings, sliding a single, rigid document across the scarred wood. The player looked at the paper, then at the man behind the desk, and realized the leverage had shifted. There was no room for negotiation. The document was a cage, and for the first time, it was a cage that held. The era of the handshake deal was dead. The league was finally beginning to own its own house. With the players bound by ink, the owners turned their gaze to the grass. The games themselves were still a mess, a collection of brawls masquerading as sport. Every town had its own version of the rules, and every referee called the game by his own whim. It was time to strip away the chaos. The league office pushed out a new, uniform rulebook, demanding that every team play by the same set of constraints. On a Sunday in late autumn, the difference became visible. A player lunged, leading with a shoulder. The whistle blew, sharp and immediate. The referee did not hesitate. The players stopped, confused. The old way of settling disputes with fists was being replaced by the cold, precise language of the whistle. The game had finally shed its skin as a local scrap and emerged as a professional sport. Standardized rules were a victory, but the league still lacked a heartbeat. Games remained sporadic, occurring only when 2 owners agreed on a price and a field. A fan might travel miles to a stadium, only to find the gates locked and the field empty. The league was a series of disconnected events, not a season. The owners recognized the void. They sat down with a blank map and a calendar, mapping out a rigid, league-wide schedule. Every team was assigned a date, a venue, and an opponent months in advance. The impact was immediate. For the first time, a fan in a factory town could look at a printed schedule and see the entire arc of the autumn unfolding. They could plan their Sundays, anticipate the rivalries, and track the standings as the weeks progressed. The game was no longer a random occurrence. It was a rhythmic, reliable pursuit. The schedule became the spine of the league, holding the disparate teams together in a single, unified narrative. Fans began to invest not just in a single game, but in the journey of the season itself. The league had finally built a calendar that the public could trust. Then the economy collapsed. By the 1930s, the Great Depression turned industrial towns into ghost cities. Factories shuttered, wages vanished, and the spare change that once bought a ticket to the stadium disappeared. The league teetered on the edge of total extinction. Owners met in rooms thick with cigar smoke and desperation, counting their losses as attendance plummeted to near zero. Some argued to lock the gates and walk away. Instead, they chose a different path. They stopped selling individual games and started selling a unified front. They marketed the league as a singular, unbreakable entity. They printed stories of grit and endurance, framing every Sunday match as a testament to American resolve. When people had nothing else to hold on to, they held on to the schedule. The brand became a refuge. The league survived the hardest decade in American history, emerging not as a collection of failing teams, but as a singular, enduring institution. The 1950s arrived with a flicker of static that would change everything. Heavy, glass-faced television sets began appearing in living rooms across the country, replacing the radio as the focal point of the American home. At first, the owners were terrified. They feared the screen would keep fans on their couches, leaving the stadiums hollow and silent. They were wrong. When the first cameras were positioned on the sidelines, they did not capture just a game. They captured the scale of the brand. The NFL was ready. They had a logo, a name, and a visual identity that looked sharp even in black and white. As the signal traveled through the air and into millions of homes, the league became a guest in the private lives of the public. Families gathered around the glowing tube, watching the action unfold in real time. The broadcast turned the local hero into a national icon and the stadium into a shared space for the entire country. The screen acted as a magnifying glass, turning the league's rigid structure into a high-stakes drama. The game had leaped off the muddy field and into the heart of the nation. The transformation was no longer a slow evolution. It was a total conquest. By the late 1950s, the league had moved beyond the stadium gates and into the marrow of American life. Monday mornings at the water cooler were no longer about the weather or the news. They were about the plays, the scores, and the rivalries. The brand had become a common language. From the industrial hubs of the North to the sprawling suburbs of the West, owners who once scrambled for nickels now found themselves presiding over a cultural monolith. The game had become a ritual. It dictated the pace of the weekend, the layout of the living room, and the collective heartbeat of the nation. Every tackle, every touchdown, and every penalty was dissected with the intensity of a national emergency. The league was no longer just organizing a sport, it was defining the culture. It stood as a titan, holding the entire country in its grip. The scale of the league today defies the modest origins of those early, desperate meetings. What was once a collection of teams struggling to pay players for a single afternoon now operates as a multi-billion-dollar institution. The revenue streams are vast, flowing from global broadcast rights, massive sponsorship deals, and merchandise that reaches every corner of the map. Yet, this financial titan rests on a foundation laid in 1922. That single, decisive moment, striking the cumbersome APFA from the records, and adopting the sharp three-letter identity of the NFL, provided the spark that ignited this entire engine. The name was the catalyst. It turned a chaotic, local pastime into a professional brand that investors could trust and fans could identify. Every dollar generated today, every contract signed, and every stadium built carries the weight of that original branding strategy. They traded a bureaucratic tangle for a clear, punchy symbol, and in doing so, they created a machine that could scale indefinitely. The ultimate expression of this evolution arrives every February. The Super Bowl has transcended the sport itself, becoming a global spectacle that commands the eyes of the world. Planes circle overhead, lights flood the stadium, and the roar of the crowd reaches a pitch that vibrates through the very concrete of the earth. It is a massive, carefully choreographed machine of entertainment, a far cry from the muddy, uneven fields where the league first struggled for survival. In 1920, a game might have been played in front of a few dozen people in a rain-soaked lot in Ohio. Today, The Super Bowl is a planetary event, a singular moment where commerce, performance, and competition collide on a stage that dwarfs anything those early owners could have imagined. The contrast is absolute. Where there was once silence and uncertainty, there is now a deafening, manufactured perfection. The spectacle is the final product of decades of branding and structural refinement. It is the point where the game ceases to be a local contest and becomes a universal language. The transformation is complete, leaving behind the dust of the past to stand as a monument to the power of a single, well-placed identity. The lesson of this history is not found in the roar of the stadium or the flashing lights of the broadcast. It is found in the quiet, scarred wooden table of that office in Canton. Greatness, as the league proved, is not merely the quality of the game played on the field, but the strength of the identity built around it. When those men stripped away the bureaucratic tangle of the APFA, they were not just changing a name. They were defining a purpose. They understood that without a symbol, the game was just a series of disconnected events. By choosing 3 sharp, percussive letters, they gave the world a handle to grasp. They created a brand that could hold the weight of a nation's attention. Today, the league stands as a titan, yet every aspect of its modern dominance traces back to that single, pivotal realization. The structure provided the framework, but the identity provided the fire. It is a reminder that even the most massive institutions are built on the smallest, most deliberate choices. The foundation laid in that damp, dimly lit room remains the bedrock of the entire enterprise. It proves that to change the game, one must first be brave enough to name it. The legacy of the league is not just in its longevity, but in the clarity of its vision, a vision that began with a simple, bold strike against the status quo. The legacy does not rest on the achievements of the past. It is fueled by the relentless, daily application of the structure those early owners fought to establish. Every contract signed, every rule refined, and every broadcast deal negotiated acts as a gear in a machine that never stops turning. The brand is the spark, but the framework is the oxygen that keeps the fire burning across decades. This is how a local association evolves into a permanent institution. The league office operates with a precision that would have been unrecognizable to the men in that Canton room. They have turned the game into a predictable, reliable product. It is a cycle of constant expansion. New markets open, new technologies integrate, and the reach of the organization stretches further into the daily lives of millions. The growth is not accidental. It is the result of a rigid, unwavering commitment to the systems that protect the brand's integrity. Today, the league is more than a collection of teams. It is a sprawling, interconnected network that feeds on its own success. The foundation remains, but the structure has become a towering, complex edifice that continues to build upward, driving forward with a force that requires no further introduction. Yet, the view from the summit is deceptive. To believe the league reached its current height without resistance is to ignore the scars beneath the surface. Success is a magnet for conflict, and as the organization solidified its grip on the nation, it began to fracture from within. The very structure that provided stability also created rigid boundaries that others sought to break. Power, once concentrated, becomes a target. Throughout the decades, the league faced waves of internal dissent and external pressure that threatened to dismantle the entire framework. It was not a smooth ascent. It was a series of defensive maneuvers against those who viewed the league's dominance as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Owners clashed over control. Franchises pushed against the central authority. The system was constantly tested by the weight of its own success. These were not merely administrative disputes. They were existential battles for the soul of the sport. Every era of growth brought a new challenger, a new threat to the established order that forced the league to evolve or face obsolescence. The path to becoming a cultural titan was paved with these high-stakes confrontations. The stability we see today is the result of surviving a brutal war. But the greatest storm was yet to break. While the league focused on its own internal mechanics, a new force gathered in the shadows, fueled by ambition and a desire to dismantle the status quo. This was not a minor disagreement or a simple power struggle between owners. It was the rise of the American Football League. The AFL arrived with a different vision, a faster pace, and a hunger that the established order had long since forgotten. It was a direct challenge to the NFL's monopoly, a high-stakes war for the hearts and minds of the American public. The battlefield was not just the gridiron, it was the television contract, the scouting department, and the very definition of professional football. For the first time, the Titan faced a mirror image of its own early, desperate days, a challenger that played by different rules and refused to yield. This was the clash that would push the sport to its breaking point. It was the fire that would burn away the old ways and forge the modern, spectacle-driven game we recognize today. The era of unchallenged dominance was over. The war for the soul of football had begun, and it would change everything.